Hello, welcome back to Walk Through the Word as we are in the book of Judges today. Judges gets its name from the judges whom God raised up to lead his people. These judges, these men, a couple women involved there too, these judges were not judges as we think of today, presiding over a court case, but rather they were chosen to lead the children of God, the Israelites, militarily, number one, as well as administrative and spiritual guidance. So they would have sort of a multi-purpose as God would choose them to be leaders of the people, military, administrative, as well as spiritual leaders. We get that from the book of Judges, chapter 2, verse 16, where it says, "Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them." Spoiled them as in plundered. There's a military term, the plunders of war, the spoils of war. In the book of Acts, in the 13th chapter, Paul is speaking in Antioch, and in the 20th verse, after he had spoken to them about God leading them through into the promised land and giving them nations and so on, the conquered nations, he divided the land to them. And then in verse 20, after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. So it's a very important time in the life of the children of Israel after they returned to the promised land through the Exodus, God leading them to the promised land, that God would then raise up judges to rule over them. The judges are divided into two groups, majors and minors. The major judges are the ones that you know about. That would be Deborah, Gideon, Samson, the Jephthah, the more well-known ones. And the minors then would be the Othniels, the Ehuds, Shamgars, and so on and so forth. It changes depending on what you look at, who compiles the list of judges, from 12 to 15. But the 15 names are as follows: Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. Abimelech is listed in some of the list of judges, but not in others. The reason being is, remember what I read, that God or the Lord raised up judges. Abimelech him and his cohorts were trying to elevate him to the position of a king. So he's sort of disregarded as a judge. Eli is in some people's list of a judge, but he was also a priest. So he was a priest and a judge. But it does say in the book of Judges, I think it's in the 4th chapter, where it says that he actually judged the people for such and such a year. So Eli was also known as a judge. But he had sort of a dual purpose, judge and a priest, as well as Samuel. Some consider him a judge. Some consider him a prophet. He is the first of the great prophets that we are introduced to in the Bible. So 12 or 15, depending on how you number them. Who wrote it? Unknown author. Some say Samuel, one of his disciples, one of his, he probably had people who helped him out or whatever, but it's really unknown. The authorship is unknown. Why? Why was the book written? The purpose is to present Israel's declining spiritual state, their apostasy. And apostasy is a disregard or a departure from your religious roots or your religious upbringing or so on. So they were backsliding. We read about them quite often, that term quite often in the Old Testament concerning Israel, when they were backsliding. They were removing themselves from God's will and God's leadership and all those things in their life. They were removing. God wasn't removing them. They were removing by their actions. They were separating themselves from God as sin separates us from God. And the other side of that is God's mercy, that he didn't destroy them. He made a promise This promise came very real in the person of Abraham, in the life of Abraham, to his seed. All the nations of the world will be blessed, and it would go through this seed line, and this seed line is going through here in the book of Judges. So God was not going to destroy the people, even though they deserved to be destroyed because of their apostasy. And he forgave them and held them together as a nation. Where does it take place? It takes place in the land of Canaan. Israel is going to be born as a kingdom very soon after the time of the Judges, but right now is known as the land of Canaan, or the land of Israel. They're not synonymous terms, although sometimes we use them synonymously. Canaan was a larger part, a region there, Israel being a part of Canaan. So Israel was in Canaan, but Canaan was not in Israel, as Israel was a subset, as there were other kingdoms or tribes of people that were existing, living, had established themselves in the land of Canaan. Remember the list of those ites, those Hivites, and the Jebusites, and so on. All those different ites that we read about in the Old Testament. So it was in that land between the Great Sea. On the west and on the east, you had the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, and that sliver of land there. Not very big piece of land that God had shown to Abraham as he looked to the north, the south, the east, and the west. That's the land where Judges takes place now. When we lose a certain amount of chronology in the book of Judges, up until Joshua, the Pentateuch and Joshua, it's pretty close chronologically. It's the account of God, right in the beginning, and the Adam and Eve and everything, and the leading of God's people up until this time. But now in the book of Judges, it isn't just chronological. There's some other books that are sprinkled in there. We get some things that happen in Joshua. Those are included in Judges. The timeline is sort of mixed up there between Joshua and Judges, as well as we read about Ruth, which is inserted in the midst of the time of the Judges, as well as some of 1 Samuel is sprinkled in there also. But generally, the book of Judges takes place from the death of Joshua in Judges chapter 1, verse 1, until the birth of Samuel. And that is from 1372 to 1126 BC. That's the period of time, 1372 to 1126 BC. And again, these are the dates from Edwin Reese Chronological Bible. If yours are a little different, that's the reason being. During this time, or right towards the end of the time of the Judges, Israel would become a world power. They would be established, of course, under the kingship of David ultimately, but Saul, David, Solomon, and so on. But at the end of the time of the Judges, and it was when Israel would rise to become a world power. As the author is not known, neither do we know the exact time of the writing of this, but rather it's probably a chronicle of events that are happening during the time of the Judges. What happens? What is the book of Judges? We already said why it is. It's the decline, the apostasy of the children of Israel as they departed from the will of God. And how did that happen? Right away, chapter 1, the book of Judges hits us after, verse 21. Chapter 1, verse 21. We see the failure of Israel to conquer the land as God had commanded them to do. Verse 21, we read, "The children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem, but the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day." And of course, there's a lot of history packed into each one of these verses. I'm just going to read just a portion of these verses in chapter 1, which show Israel's failure to conquer the land, which was a command of God. Verse 27, "Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean." Verse 29, "Neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer." 30, "Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, nor the inhabitants of Nahalal, but the Canaanites dwell among them and became tributaries." 31, "Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Akko." 33, neither did Naphtali drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh. 34, the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountain. So we see here how they were not able to, or they were not willing to drive the people out of the land. In chapter 2, we are reminded of the command of God, what they were to do in that land. So the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt, reminding us and them, of course, of the Exodus, and have brought you into the land which I swear unto your fathers, the promise that was given unto Abraham. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. That's important to remember. Even though the people were separated from God, now it was not God's fault. He didn't break his covenant with them. He does not break his promises. They departed or removed themselves from God by their actions, their deeds, their words. Ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of the land. Ye shall throw down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and your gods shall be a snare unto you. And this reminds us of what we read about, we study about in Deuteronomy chapter 7, how God tells them through Moses that when you go return to the land which I promised to swear unto your fathers, that you are to drive out all of these people, all these Jebusites, these Hivites, these Hittites, drive them, Amalekites, all of them, Amorites, drive them out of the land, destroy their altars, tear down their groves, destroy them, don't take any spoils of war, and really to kill all of them. So they would be a preserved people unto God, so he could do his work, begin to unveil his plan of salvation through them and the promise of the Messiah. The worship and everything would be a picture and a point towards the Messiah, the coming of the Christ. So that's what happened. They were not obedient unto God, so he was going to punish them in not destroying the countries or the nations that they should have destroyed. In chapter 3, we see that, or chapter 2 first is another account of the death of Joshua, who had led them into the promised land. Chapter 3, then we come to, chapter 2, the raising up of judges. And I'm going to read a portion of that, because I think when we come to Judges, we'll see the miraculous provision that God has for his people. And it's a picture how God provides for us. In the Judges, I see a picture of Christ. As the judges did not raise themselves up as the high priest did, they were born into that position, as the kings later would, as they were born into that position. But God would raise up judges to lead them out from among their enemies. And of course, the greatest enemy that we have is our sin. So I see in the Judges a picture of Christ, as God would deliver us and protect us for his glory and for our ultimately our salvation. Chapter 2, verse 16. Nevertheless, I love the word "but" in the Bible, and this "nevertheless" is a big long but. Even though the people were backsliding, even because of in spite of their apostasy, God loved them and he was going to deliver them. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. And yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves unto them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repented the Lord because of their groanings by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings nor from their stubborn way. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, because that this people hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and have not hearkened unto my voice, I also will not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died, that through them I may prove or test Israel, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk therein as their fathers did keep it or not. Therefore the Lord left these nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. So God is going to test his people to see if they would be obedient unto his word and drive those pagans out of the other of Canaan, and that they would not then go, as it said, a whoring after other gods, that they would be true unto what God had called them unto. So that's the calling of the judges. We see in this God's provision, his miraculous deliverance for his people, because he loved them and for the sake of his promise. Chapter 3, then we have the list of those nations that God did not destroy and would really become a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites if they did not hearken unto the will of the Lord. And also in chapter 3, then we see Othniel, the first judge that God raised up to judge his people. Remember, military, administrative, as well as spiritual needs of the people. God would raise up these men now, or people, because there were some women judges. But Othniel was the first judge. In the fourth and fifth chapter, here's a woman judge, Deborah, or as some people say, Deborah. And we can read the account of Deborah and Barak, her, what would you say, chief of staff or something like that, or her military man, that they would go up against who were they going up against? I forget now. I could look at it. The Kenites, I think it was. But anyway, that they would go against this enemy, and Barak was hesitant to go. He said, "Unless you go with me, I'm not going to go." And Deborah says, "Well, you're going to go, but you're going to see also that the enemy is going to be delivered unto you through the deeds of a woman." And in this account, then we are introduced to Sisera, the general of the army of the enemies, and Jael, which then killed Sisera in a quite gruesome manner, and how Israel then was victorious over the enemy through the actions of Jael, who killed Sisera in this or after this war. So that's the account of Deborah and Barak, and you can read that to your children, especially if they are of age to understand all this stuff. There's some gruesome stuff in the book of Judges. It's sort of a depressing book if you look at just that side of it, rather than putting it all together, how God still sustained them and kept them as his people. In chapter 6 and 7, we're introduced to Gideon, another major judge, one that we know quite a bit about. First of all, Gideon and the Fleece. He was reluctant to be a judge, and he asked God that God would give him a sign, and he put the fleece out in the yard, and I don't know, I might have this backwards, but if the fleece would be wet in the morning and the ground dry around it, then he would know that God would call him to be a judge of the people Israel. And the other way around, then the next morning, if the fleece was dry and the ground was wet, or that would be a sign. And then Gideon said, "Okay, I will lead the people," and he led them into battle then against the Midianites. And Gideon had called this large army, 32,000 people who were willing to go, and God then, through his strange ways, we might say, winnowed this down to an army of 300, lest Gideon and the army would say that we have defeated the Amorites. God would defeat the Amorites in his miraculous way. And it's a little strange way, as they were told to put oil in these clay pots, and they would go and surround the enemy, and then they would break these clay pots, and they would make noise, and they would startle the enemy, and the enemy would run all over the place, and through that the enemy would be conquered. Israel would be victorious over the Midianites. In chapter 9, we read about Abimelech, who wanted to raise himself up as a king, which did not happen. In chapter 11 and 12, another sad story, we're introduced to the judge named Jephthah. He was going to battle against the Amorites, and he said if God would deliver the Amorites unto him and his army, and God would do that delivering, then he would sacrifice the first thing that he would see when he returns home, not knowing again really what he was saying. Well, the Israelites were victorious over the Amorites, Jephthah returns home, and the first thing he sees is his daughter coming out of the tent. So being true to his vow, he sacrificed his daughter. Now there's some dispute among commentators and whatever as did this really happen. But the Bible does say that Jephthah's daughter was mourned unto this day. So they mourned the passing of this daughter. What that meant, I don't know. It seems to be that Jephthah did indeed sacrifice, but human sacrifice was not God's plan. So it's a difficult thing to comprehend. Did they mourn just that she was not then given the life of a typical woman to get married and bear children or so on? What was the mourning? I don't know what that really was. I'm sorry. Can't help you out on that one. But that's the Jephthah's vow. We find that in chapters 11 through 12. 13 through 16, we're introduced to probably the biggest well-known judge, and that's Samson. What little boy doesn't know something about Samson and his feat? How he tied the foxes' tails together and caused them and lit them on fire, and then caused them to run in the fields of the Philistines to burn down the grain. We're introduced to the Philistines, who would be an arch enemy of the Israelites, even into the time of King David. And then he would kill 1,000 with the jawbone of an ass. A miraculous warrior, deliverance, how the enemy was delivered into the hands of Samson through these miraculous means that God had provided. But then we're introduced a little to the dark side of Samson as he falls in love with a Philistine woman named Delilah. And he has taken the vow of a Nazirite. And the Nazirites were not to drink strong drink. They were not to touch a dead animal. And they were not to cut their hair. And Delilah tricked Samson into telling her what the secret was, because she was really aligned with the Philistines, because she was a Philistine by birth and raised. She was gonna be a traitor to her husband. As he was bound there by the Philistines with these cords. And she, or later on, he was bound with his cords. But he did tell her then that his strength was in his hair. Not that he had muscles in his hair, but that the vow that he had taken, his long hair was a vow that he would be obedient unto God. Well, during a nap, his hair was cut and he lost his strength. He was not able to break the bonds that he had been tied down with, and he was thrown in prison. His eyes were put out, and he was made to work like a mule. And the last thing he did, and the last thing in his life, was that he was blind, and he asked that they would lead him up to the building where he was, and he would put him next to the pillars, and there were many people up on top of the ceiling, the roof of that building, and he pulled down these pillars, and the Bible tells us that he killed more in his death than he did even during his life. The Hebrew, we go back to the New Testament, Hebrews here. Let's read a verse concerning these judges. In the Hall of Fame, chapter 11, in the book of Hebrews, we read one verse, 11:32. What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets. So here we see Gideon, Barak, who was the military leader under Deborah, the judge. We see Samson. We see Jephthah. Samuel, if you would include him as a judge. We see these judges now mentioned in the chapter of faith, that they were faithful unto God. So here we see Jephthah and that vow that he made. We see Samson and all that he was wrapped up in his life, and they're mentioned there in the faith chapter in the book of Hebrews. So they were faithful in that they believed God. The rest of the book of Judges is really quite sad. As I already mentioned, the book of Judges is sort of depressing and sad when we see the decline already of the Israelites before they're even a kingdom. We see their apostasy, their turning away from God. And the result of that apostasy was As they turned away from God, they turned to idolatry, fornication, murders and slaughterings, a resultant war with the Benjamites as the children of Israel fought against each other. They were a divided house. And the book of Judges sort of ends on a sad note. If we would forget about God's promise, which we shouldn't, but if we would, it would be a very sad verse. As the last verse in the book of Judges tells us, in those days there was no king in Israel, as if it's almost like they had no leadership, no ruling, because they had forgotten God as their ruler, as their king, you might say. And every man did that which was right in his own eyes. It's a sad commentary on the children of Israel. And it really is a commentary even on our life today, that if every man would do what was right in his own eyes, it would not end well. So this is where we end the book of Judges, and we'll continue within that same time period in the book of Ruth next time. God's peace to all.